So this is just to say thank you while we're waiting for the technology to start working. I was specifically interested in responding in the call for papers in the invitation articulated in the invitation to rethink the new materiality of photography. I believe it was mentioned in relation to the stereo photography, examples of which you've seen earlier. I'll try to do something quite different today and relate the problematic of the new materiality in relation to the form of tableau. So it's a relatively new term, tableau, and it was first developed by French curator and critic Jean-François Chevrier in the 1980s. Is the speed at which I'm speaking, is that okay? Is all right, okay, fine. But it entered the public discourse after it has been adopted by American art historian Michael Fried in the early 2000s. Narrowly specific to modernist and postmodernist debates in the American context, these interpretations obscure, in my mind, the most radical implication of the potential of the form tableau to establish a relationship to the viewer by virtue of its material presence. And I will argue this point in relation to the photographic work of the French artist Jean-Marc Bustamante. So what do we talk about when we talk about tableau? In the recent past, tableau came to define large-scale color photography intended for the museum wall and linked to the historical tradition of figurative painting. Indeed, the French word tableau, as translator Brian Holmes explained, typically refers to an easel painting. At the same time, he notes, and I quote, "It can be applied to the form of any framed or mounted picture. No English word permits this ambiguity," claims Holmes, and therefore justifies his use of the French term as a title, concept, and common name. And that is the right that I also allow myself by, as you can see, I'm using the French word tableau, and I think it deserves to be left alone in French. It was in this original understanding of tableau that the term was first developed by French curator and critic Jean-François Chevrier. This is just a title of his book, to define the new development in contemporary photography. He based his assessment of the rise of what he saw as a new kind of photography, practiced by such artists as John Copeland, Craig Horsfield, Suzanne Lafont, and Jeff Wall. His analysis was presented in a number of essays, notably in The Adventures of the Picture Form in the History of Photography, which appeared in 1989 in the catalogue of exhibition he curated, Fotokunst, and also in Art Objectivity, and that's the catalogue that I've reproduced here. Here, Chevrier explains that the use of large-size photography mounted on the wall speaks of artists' aspiration to give their work, and I quote, "weight and gravity within an actualized perceptual space of an object of thought," unquote. Emphatically, tableau does not serve to simply, and I quote again, to elevate the photographic image to the place and rank of the painting, unquote. It does something more important than that. For Chevrier, the size and frontality of tableau testifies to its intention to summon a confrontational experience on the part of the spectator. The emphasis for Chevrier clearly was on the capacity of the form of tableau to establish a relation to the viewer, which I will discuss in greater detail in the later part of this presentation. First, however, I wanted to use this opportunity to correct some misconceptions that still surround the term tableau, which stem precisely from the elevation of the photographic image to the place and rank of painting. This idea is largely part of a clash between specific critical positions in the context of American art and criticism. I refer, of course, in the opposition to the opposition between modernist formalism associated with the figure of Clement Greenberg and critical postmodernism of the writers who rallied around the October Journal in the 1970s. Photography played a key role in the postmodern reversal that signaled structural transformation of the cultural field, since indexical quality was interpreted by Rosalind Krauss as means of opposing, and I quote Krauss, the language of aesthetic convention and the kind of history they encode, unquote. Certainly for Greenberg, photography relies too much on narrative to be considered self-contained artistic medium, whose quintessential expression he found in abstract painting. It was then wholly unexpected that several decades later, Greenberg's follower, Michael Fried, should pronounce tableau photography as the rightful inheritor to the tradition of modernist painting. In 2008, this American artist published Why Photography Matters as Art as Never Before, which you see on the slide, where he claimed that photography, and I quote Fried, had its destination on the wall of the museum, from the first on the level of form, unquote. This seemed to be a radical U-turn for Fried, given that photography's referential attachment to phenomena outside the picture frame would seem to condemn it to the state of objecthood, antithetical to art according to Fried's own schema. I refer to art and objecthood, of course. 30 years later, Fried proclaimed that the best examples of the tradition of modernist painting can be found in tableau photography, in the examples of work by such artists as Jeff Wall, Thomas Dermont, and Veronique Dijkstra. In reality, as Dermot Costello compellingly demonstrated quite recently, Fried's reappraisal of photography, far from representing a radical U-turn, should be seen, in fact, as a logical extension of the terms of his earlier critical position. That is, it is precisely because it has successfully asserted its status as art against attachment to the object that photography matters as art, and is able then to rejoin the tradition of modernist painting. Now, many valid objections can be and have been drawn against Michael Fried's incorporation of contemporary photographic practices into the modernist paradigm. Many of these objections have been presented from a standpoint of ontological and institutional critique, focusing in particular on photography's identity as an artistic medium and its place in the museum. In this paper, I adopt a different approach. I propose to analyze material and analytical properties of tableau photography itself in the example of the work of Jean-Marc Bustamante. Fried considers Bustamante, alongside Jeff Wall and Thomas Ruff, as the main proponents of the form of tableau. However, only a small number of critics, including Chevrier, Jacinto Laguerre, and Jean-Pierre Créqui, asserted the significance of Bustamante's work for the history of photography. This is partially due to the fact that for Bustamante, photography represents only an aspect of a truly multidisciplinary practice, which also combines sculpture, painting, design, and installation. And an assessment of Bustamante's role in development of the form of tableau, in fact, is long overdue, not least because the artist was one of the first to use the term in relation to his photographic works. In 1978, he embarked on making a series of photographs he would retrospectively give the title of tableau, and you can see here on the slide an example of the photograph from the series. The series would ultimately encompass 138 images depicting territories in the liminal state of transformation. Most of the photographs were taken on the outskirts of Barcelona at a time when new housing developments of the suburbs were being constructed. They show land already reclaimed from nature, but not yet inhabited. We see areas of wasteland, traversed by a dirt track, a pine wood through which the branches of which electric cables trail, buildings in various states of construction, from bare foundations to newly finished houses, but as yet devoid of human presence. In the absence of human presence, attention shifts to the unremarkable properties of the settings, which emerge as the true subject of the photograph. This approach invites a direct comparison with the project of the new topographics in the US, where landscape was reduced to the state of topographic site through the withdrawal of narrative and emotion. Indeed, at the time, back in the 1970s, like many other French artists of his generation working with photography, Bustamante admitted the strong influence of Robert Adams and Louis Bolts. At the same time, Bustamante seems less interested in the project of documenting the effects of human activity on land than in the unremarkable quality of the landscape itself, the absence of any distinct qualities or purpose. This suggests that the aims of his project were conceptual rather than documentary. And I use conceptual in a historically specific sense, referring to art practices of the previous generation. Elimination of human presence, narrative, and effect as a matter of principle in tableau revokes the commitment to the aesthetic of indifference of conceptual photography, as exemplified by the works of such artists as Ed Ruscha, Saul Levitt, Hans-Peter Feldman, and others. Further to this, the format of the series adopted by Bustamante corresponds to what Mel Bochner, who is one of the main theoreticians of conceptual photography, has called a serial attitude of conceptual art, orientated towards producing multiple variants of the same motif or a theme. The individual titles of the works in the tableau series highlight their position within the series. Bustamante devised a dryly pragmatic system of designation where each work was given a serial number, which located within the series within a given year. So to give you an example here on the slide, you see it's a tableau, so T stands for a tableau, number 8, 79. So 79 relates to the year it was made in. Number 8, the sequential number of it in the series, and the title is self-evident. So it's kind of, it functions, this is what I mean about this kind of the multiple variants, the conceptual multiple variants within a particular series. By the end of the 1970s, conceptual and post-conceptual practices ossified into a legacy venerated as much as resisted, in France in any case. In departure from a preference for neutral lighting and illumination of atmospheric effects, raised to a matter of principle in much of conceptual photography, in tableau, Bustamante engaged in sensual exploration of the effects of sunlight on landscape. And this image in particular, I think, gives a very good indication of what it looks like. Usually taken when sun was at the highest point, Bustamante's photographs seem to radiate the dry heat we readily recognize as peculiar to Mediterranean climate. The sensual exploration of atmospheric effect is highlighted through the use of lush color and adoption of the large format. And in fact, during a panel I organized at Tate Modern last year, at which Bustamante was present, he explained that he was interested in transforming the iconic poverty of simple things into visual magnificence. I think the use of the word magnificence is quite apt here. So for tableau, Bustamante used the largest formats of photographic prints available at the time, 103 by 130 centimeters, although some prints in the series are slightly smaller. And he was making those very large-scale prints from equally large negatives. They're measuring 20 by 25 centimeters. The artist also used the extended field of depth control, producing photographs where much of the image was sharply focused. The all-over focus in a high-resolution print of this size caused the eye, and I quote, to waver between afocality and identification of discrete points, a situation where the toing and froing between these two factors presupposes a duration that greedily exceeds any mere assumption of awareness, unquote. The description of the process of engagement with tableau given by Jean-Pierre Créqui draws attention to the fact that these images require extended attention span. Because there is nothing to see, that we have to look long. And there is nothing to see, not only in the sense that unremarkable views offer little in terms of narrative or information, but because the eye, in a state of toing and froing between blur and identification, simply cannot get beyond the surface of the image, which contains all visual information distributed evenly over a substantial area of a print. There is nothing to see but the surface of the photograph, bounded by a rectangular frame. The artist returned to this problematic with a series entitled Cyprès from 1991, or Cypress, where he took the process of compression of the visual information on the surface of the image to a new level. Bustamante investigated in a highly systematic manner the motif of the cypress hedge across a series of 22 photographs. I won't show you 22, but I'll show you just 3, and you'll see what I'm talking about. The cypress hedge fills the photographic frame completely, foreclosing perspectival and narrative dimensions, so that only the surface is left visible. In this process, the surface of the photograph seems to grow thick with materiality of the hedge, whose physical form and texture of the branches becomes concretely and objectively present to the viewer. The photograph, without ceasing to be a flat tableau, extends into the third dimension. Penelope Curtis has perceptively described this manner of delineating a relationship between of image to object as an attempt, and I quote, to find the form behind the image in front, unquote, to indicate the hidden depth behind the thinnest of surfaces. Now, this search for the form behind the image resulted in Bustamante combining photography and sculpture in a single installation. Stationnaire, or Stationary, a series from 1990s, the already discussed series Cypress were conceived as part of the room-size installation entitled Stationnaire, or Stationary, which exists in two versions. What you see on the slide here is the Stationnaire number 1, the photographs were hung on the wall, while the floor area was occupied by L-shaped structures set at various angles. The subsequent version, Stationary number 2, included only photographs which were encased in boxes made from the same material as the L-shaped structures, kind of quite heavy industrial resin. The boxes were supplied with lids, which meant that they could be closed, shut, and then stacked up. And the positioning of the boxes on the floor signaled an important new development in Bustamante's engagement with photography. And if in tableau the eye was led onto the exploration of specific locations depicted in the image, as the photograph migrated from its position on the wall to the floor, it could no longer be mistaken for a window opening onto reality. It concurrently acquired materiality and presence of a sculptural object, which was accentuated through the presentation of the image as part of the physical object that contains it, i.e. the boxes. This is not the conclusion that Michael Fried reaches when he analyzes Stationary number 1 in Why Photography Matters as Never Before. He believes, and I quote Michael Fried, the juxtaposition of the photograph and the sculptural elements would be felt to point to a contrast between the two kinds of elements, rather than their similarity as objects, unquote. Fried's profound knowledge of art history leads him to correctly identify in the sculptural shapes in Stationary number 1 the historical precedent in Robert Morris's entitled L-beams from 1965. But even while establishing a link with the seminal work of minimalist sculpture, Fried maintains that Bustamante's work, and I quote Fried again, has consistently refused the minimalist option to pursue a range of broadly photographic aims, unquote. Even given the proviso broadly photographic, this interpretation seems unacceptably reductive, trapped in a discourse of medium specificity, terms of which were established back in the 1960s. These debates, as Chevrier has been passionately arguing, have been largely irrelevant for the development of artistic practices and critical discourses outside of the US. These ideas seem certainly irrelevant when considering Bustamante's work, and not only because, in the words of Katie Siegel, he is a photographer deeply engaged with sculpture, whose sculptures, like his photographs, are often closely tied to painting. What the artist described as his ambition to give the photograph the dimension of the tableau, to transform it into an object, clearly followed the path of the reformulation of the minimalist object. And in this context, I think it is really important to highlight the striking parallels between Bustamante's transformation of the color photograph into an object and Jeff Wall encasing cyberchrome transparency in a light box. As Bryony Fair has argued, the status of the light box as an object suggests that it occupies a place between painting and sculpture, moves that have their echoes in discourses of minimalist art. Wall's light boxes, as we know, have become, for his supporters and detractors alike, the main point of reference in defining the shift from post-conceptual practices to art photography. This is largely due to the fact that Wall's art enjoys great visibility and it's supported by his highly articulate theorization of his own practice. But the history of this negotiation of post-conceptual practices clearly needs to be corrected to make place for Bustamante alongside Wall, especially since both artists arrived at the form of tableaux simultaneously. As you have seen, Bustamante's earliest tableau date from 1978, which is also the date when Wall produced his first successful lightbox transparency. In the case of both artists, in their work we witness what can be described as the thickening of material substratum. In the case of Wall, as Brian Ifer explained, the three-dimensional nature of the lightbox, the fact that it juts out from the wall, allows it to be experienced as a phenomenal object. It imposes a model of interaction that demands heightened awareness of the psyche, of the physical spatial registers that objects in the photographs inhabit. Likewise, when we turn to Bustamante's tableau, we see that not only it extends inwardly to indicate, as Penelope Curtis has argued, the form behind its surface, but also outwardly in the space of the observer. As Bustamante explained, the tableau, above all, is an object of thought, which resists analysis and presupposes a unique relationship with the spectator. This echoes directly Chevrillier's idea, evoked in the beginning of this paper, that the size and frontality of tableau testify to its intention to summon a confrontational experience on the part of the spectator. In other words, it is not enough that the tableau is framed on the wall to be looked at like paintings, as Michael Fried would have it. The photograph is transformed into an object, its newly found formulated materiality posing challenge to photographic ontology. And I come to my conclusion. The emergence of the form of tableau was determined by a number of factors, of which in this paper I focused only on developments of artistic and intellectual spheres. Adoption of this form allowed artists such as Wall and Bustamante to negotiate the legacy of minimalism and conceptual practices by conceiving of the photograph as a material object, requiring audience engagement that goes beyond the mode of static contemplation. This moment of consolidation and thickening of the photograph's material support has to be reconsidered outside the debates arising from defenders and detractors of medium specificity. While the emergence of the form of tableau has often been interpreted as one of the first serious challenges to the anti-aesthetic position voiced by critical postmodernism, this interpretation seems misjudged, given that it largely applies to art and thought in the Anglo-American context. In France, in the meantime, critics like Chevrier and artists like Bustamante put forward quite a different interpretation of the current media expansion. Interpretations that not only challenge us to think beyond media-specific categories, but above all express the complexity of the relationship of the image to the spectator as an object of thought. And I would like to end this presentation with a citation from the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, who has been long opposed to the perception of modernity as art's commitment to the medium. He writes, I quote, "The aesthetic revolution, as I understand it, means that the former equation of the artwork with a specific place and destination was replaced by the idea of the framing of a specific sensorium or a specific sphere of experience. The specific sensorium can be a museum, yet it can also be understood as a sensorium created by artistic practices that overstep the separation between senses and media." Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Я думаю, что мы имели замечательный пример talk about photography и замечательные образцы фотографий. Но поскольку да, не только, конечно, я это сказал, не только фотографий. И, может быть, действительно, вот цитата из Рансьера нам позволит как-то перейти дальше. У нас предстоит еще доклад. Нам нужно до ближайшего перерыва услышать нашего участника Илью Инишева, представляющего Высшую школу экономики, доцент Высшей школы экономики, который выступит с докладом «If the time of performative theory of photography has come». Пришло ли время перформативной теории фотографии?